religious, but you're concerned about STDs and other things that you might want to have your kids avoid. Then gender ideology is a theoretical belief that you could be born in the wrong body. So there's no evidence that is actually true in any sense. There are people that do experience gender dysphoria and ultimately go on to medically transition and do have positive outcomes. That's true. But the idea that you're born into the body, it doesn't matter if you view it from a theological perspective or a science perspective, doesn't fully make sense. And the idea is that everyone has a gender identity. I can tell you that's not true because I don't have one. I'm just a guy. Everyone does not have a gender identity. Most people do not experience gender dysphoria and have an experience of something other than what their biological sex is. I think we should have absolute compassion for people who do, but I'm just saying not everyone has that experience. And to say that everybody has a gender identity, and to the kindergartners who might really have a gender identity that's different than your biological sex is obviously going to be very confusing for young kids. Also things that are missing, like the women's immature cervix, the emotional consequences, which are harder for women than men with regard to sex. Those are typically not mentioned in comprehensive sex education, so the sort of the joke among critics is, well, we're comprehensive, but not exactly comprehensive because you're not covering some of the things that are serious consequences with women, because oxytocin plays a huge role in female attachment and male attachment as well. And that gets underemphasized. And then a lot of, some of the lessons will like suggest seeking advice from your peers, because they apparently know a lot about sex. You should rely on that peer information. And then internet advice, so like sites like Great Weight, which is more of a chastity abstinence site, they're presented as unscientific. Or unreliable. And then troubling meta messages, so just the idea that we're talking about this at school sends a message that, oh, that's just normal to talk about sex at school, and not every parent agrees with that, right? Many parents would prefer to talk about those things in the family, right? Not at school. So that's one of the meta messages. And then it doesn't take too long to kind of draw the dots and say, well, wait a second, if you're talking about some other adult at school, where does that go? Like, who should you be able to talk to this about? Yeah, go for it. You got the best questions.
I'm here, so I'm going to use my time.
Please do. Yeah.
So you talk about gender identity. Can you repeat the part about not everybody has a gender identity?
Yeah, gender identity is sense that you could have a sense of your internal self being like, I'm male, so I could have a sense that I'm female, right? Some people do have that, but the idea that everybody has a gender identity, well, I never experienced that. I just am my body. I just experience it that way.
So me identifying as female isn't my gender identity.
So, no, you would, so.
Like, I do have a gender identity.
Yeah, some people experience it and they say, I identify as female. What I'm saying is not everyone, the idea that everyone has a gender identity, that's a theoretical concept. The idea of gender identity, so it gets complicated because there are multiple ways to use the phrase gender identity. So let me define it. So if what you mean by gender identity is that you have something inside you, like an internal sense that you're something other than what you were born as, right? So in other words, you're a boy biologically, but you actually feel like you're a female. It's often talked about as like, that's my gender identity, right? And that's something that some people experience. I don't experience that as someone who's male and just feels male. I never felt like I had like this extra thing in my brain that was like my gender identity. I had to figure out I just was male.
But you do have a gender identity. I'm trying to, because
the
logic of the vocabulary is,
yeah.
Of course you have a gender identity. You're saying you're a male. You just never had to think about it.
Right.
It just, like, you took it for granted. Right?
I took it for granted, yeah, exactly. And
so you do have, it's about consciousness, awareness of.
You could argue that, right? It's just a new vocabulary term that people wouldn't have ever, it came from John Money, specifically out of dealing with kids and adults with gender dysphoria.
Like
that's why I'm saying not everybody has it.
Because like as a girl growing up, there does, ladies, come a time in your youth when you realize, I was just told I couldn't do something.
Right.
I'm a girl. So you do.
Right.
I would say 51% of the human population has a gender identity because they were forced
to know it.
They were forced to know it.
Yes.
By virtue of the wall that they hit.
So
like you might have not have even had to think about it.
Right.
But 51% of the human population absolutely has to think about it, at least.
Yeah, and the gender identity belief is almost like everybody has almost like a sex soul inside their brain somewhere that is their identity. Like that's what some people, again, it's complicated because there's a bunch of different concepts of gender identity, but it's like almost like you have a sex soul that's in there, and that's why I say when people say I was born into the wrong body, well, if you view it theologically, right, if you're a theological person, you say, well, okay, so God put the wrong soul, into a different body, right? Like you would interpret it that way. Or if you're a science person, you say, wait, I'm not born into anything, because if you don't believe in God, you would say, well, I just am my body, so how was I born into something? I just am my body. That's what I'm saying. Logically, there's a bunch of conundrums around.
Or yeah, it's like the disconnect between society's definition of what
Right.
a binary gender is
Right.
and what the human animal experience is.
Correct, yes.
And which might not match those imposed
Correct.
categories, right?
Yeah, what I-
Right,
and-
so there's more to gender than your
There,
genitals.
yes,
Yeah.
I'll agree with that. What I'm saying is, and I totally agree with that, is basically that when it comes to gender identity, we have to remember that it is a theoretical concept invented to explain gender dysphoria. That's its origins, right?
Oh,
Yeah.
I mean, you look at human history, there's definitely always been the story of gender identity.
Oh, I agree. Yeah, I don't think it's a new thing.
I think that it's important that you differentiate between you're talking about something different
Yes, yes.
than
This is the
gender
challenge.
identity.
Yes.
Yeah, so
But
vocabulary.
it's commonly referred, yeah, the challenge is that
It's getting my hackles up because as a woman,
Yeah, so
I do hear an issue here about
well, a lot of it's
saying that people don't have gender identity.
Well, a lot of it's based on stereotypes too. That's one of the things we can get into the lessons, but like, there are actually lessons, I'm not showing them tonight, where it's been done in other schools, not in Frederick County. We'll show like a G.I. Joe on one side and a Barbie on the other, and they'll ask the kids, like, where do you fit on the spectrum? And that's, to me, it's just reinforcing gender stereotypes, right? It's like, well, you're a girl that likes, sports, that's great, do what you want, right? So, but there are actual lessons about gender identity where they actually reinforce the very stereotypes that I think you and I agree are not a good idea. Or like, oh, you like math, so you must not be a girl. That's silly, but that there are actually lessons in public schools that will mention things like that are stereotypical, which seems to me highly inappropriate and actually regressive. But yeah, let's talk more about that because I have a whole gender identity section, and it is a very complicated topic.
Foundational, so thank you for entertaining, because I
Yeah,
know I
there's-
won't be able to follow what you're about to do if I don't know what you're doing.
Exactly. No, I like it. I love it, actually, your questions, and they're really good ones. And then, okay, so here's our standards, right? You don't want to send mixed messages. Promote a specific company's goods or services. You do want to provide accurate information, have it be age appropriate, and not sexually explicit. So I'm going to show you some examples. So this is from Advocates for Youth. This is materials that STPS was considering. And so I kind of labeled them, and I had Dr. Goonan, doctor who I presented with before, help me analyze these. So they say sexuality is a lifelong process, but they also say infants and children are sexual. So I disagree. Most physicians, I think, would disagree. It is true that teens and adults are sexual beings, but there's obviously more to people than just that, and you have to be careful. To what degree do you want, as a parent, to really encourage your kids to start to be sexual, right? So the Advocates for Youth, again, general message is kind of mixed, and I'll show you here. So they have some good things. Like, I really agree, I think most parents would agree, that helping children understand the concept of privacy, right? And they talk about sexuality as private and occurs at home, but weirdly enough, we're teaching it in school. And then they also say encourage children to come to them or other trusted adults for information about sexuality. You just have to be careful with that, which adults, right? You have to be very careful about that. And then I love this one, encourage communication so that your children can talk about anything. That's great, right? And then respect your child's views, share your thoughts and values, and help your child express theirs. Sort of, right? But like on the other hand, you also, if you're trying to instill a certain sense of responsibility, a certain moral code you believe in, if your child says, well, I want to have sex, well, that might be against the family values, right? So you may want to be actively discouraging. And by the way, these are kids age 6 to 8 for this, and these are kids 4 to 5. That's what these come from. So these are really young kids in this case. So I don't know, 6 to 8, like the children really don't have much concept of these things. So I struggle with the idea of respect your child and respect what they're thinking, obviously. But I think that's a little bit of a concern for me. And then I love number 8, like when they're older, teach your children ways to make good decisions about sex and coach them out of risky situations. But again, just looking at the ages, you know, I don't think I would have ever approved of another adult talking to my kids about sexuality at age 4 and 5. That seems pretty young to me. So, but that's what